Welcome, everybody. This is the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm Lucas DeHart. This is my co-host, Luke Pickrell. We have a very special guest today, historian Harvey J. Kaye. Luke.
Yeah. Hi, Harvey. Thanks for coming on. We're really excited to talk with you. We've read many of your books about Tom Paine and are really excited to dive into this topic with you. I was hoping first you could introduce yourself, who you are, where you come from, and also a little bit of your political development, how you grew up as a political person.
Okay, so anyhow, I'm professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, and I actually trained I didn't train for a career in academics. It sort of happened one by one. I got the undergraduate, then I got the first graduate degree, and then the second PhD, not second PhD, but the PhD. In any case, so I have degrees in history, political science, and sociology. But all my work is essentially historical and political more than sociological, I guess. Although the work in history is sort of a political social history, et cetera, et cetera. In the course of my 40 plus years as a professor, I wrote and edited 18 different books. I originally trained in Latin American studies. I then moved to British studies, which is a whole long story, and that's a totally separate interview. But I ended up becoming close to and the historiographer of a cohort of British historians who came to be known in part because of my work, in part because of folks over in England, the British Marxist historians. And in the course of doing that work, the historians themselves, eventually, when my book came out and was doing so well, said, well, you really ought to be doing American history. Now, not because I was American, but because of the kinds of things that I had been writing about on the side. And they said, and you can take the stuff you learned and do that. So my childhood hero was Thomas Paine. And I first encountered Paine as such in Brooklyn, New York, opposite the Brooklyn Museum where my grandparents lived. My grandfather had a collection of books by and about Thomas Paine, and one of the books really caught my imagination. It was titled Thomas Paine, the Real Author of the Declaration of Independence. And he was not. But that book, I thought the title alone was fantastic because it showed that all my school teachers had been wrong, and thus I embraced Thomas Paine. And to make the long story short, I read some of the stuff in the course of my teenage years. I can't tell anyone, I'm not going to say I understood it very well, but Paine became my hero. And when I eventually was turning to American history, I started by actually working on Thomas Paine in favor of a chapter of a book I was co-editing entitled The American Radical. Eric Foner was supposed to write that chapter, but Edward E.P. Thompson, the great British Marxist historian, passed away, and he was going to contribute the foreword to the book. So Eric said to me, Harvey, if you'd like, you write the Thomas. He knew of my affection for Paine. He said, why did you write this chapter? And I'll write the foreword. And I thought, well, I mean, if Foner's got the confidence in me, what the hell? So that was back in the early 90s, I guess. Yeah, the early 90s. And I did write that chapter. And I decided after that I didn't want to give up Thomas Paine. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and go back to the explanation of my political development that you asked me about. My grandfather, whose library influenced me, was a criminal lawyer in New York City. And all my grandparents were friends, and he and my grandmother and my other grandmother would often come out to visit us because my family had moved out to Paramus, New Jersey. And they would come like for the weekend or more likely for the Sunday. And when I was about 4 years old, before I could read, he brought along with him this golden book, a gigantic coffee table golden book. I don't know if you know what golden books are. Those were books for kids, which were mostly storybooks, like Toodles the Train or Scuffy the Tugboat, that kind of thing. And they were really beautifully illustrated. But this particular book was like an Old Testament stories for kids. But I can tell you that the actual images and writing were not really meant for 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds. But my grandfather would read the stories to me, but he would do it in a way that it was clearly a story of rebellion and resistance, that kind of thing. And moreover, he would also tell me stories about growing up on the Lower East Side in New York City, in the area that had historically been, for the late 19th century into the decades of the 20th century, where Jewish immigrants settled from all over. They had come from all over Eastern Europe. So I'm convinced when people ask me, well, what was it that led you to ask the kinds of questions you ultimately came to study? I often say it's because my grandfather creatively read these Old Testament Bible stories to me when I was a kid. Then it was also the influence of Thomas Paine on the question of democracy. And last but not least, my other grandfather, who was very, very, they eventually were all in Brooklyn. That grandfather was very close. This is in the early 50s when I was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that kind of thing. It was very close to the managers and players of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And you asked the question, so I'm giving you the answer, okay? So what happened was, as a kid, especially during the summertime, if I spent time with my grandfather and grandmother on that side of my mother's parents, I would get to go to Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. I'm not even sure at that time I fully understood the privilege of going to a ball game and sitting on the first base or third base line, and occasionally actually being escorted into the dugout at the games my grandfather wanted me to meet the players. And then when I was about 7 years of age, something like that, 8 years, my grandfather, who was really, the attachment to the Dodgers was intense, the whole family attachment. The Dodgers left Brooklyn and moved out to LA, which, by the way, made me hate California the rest of my life, just for the record. Okay. So I essentially gave up professional sports for many, many years. And now I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and needless to say, I'm a huge Packers fan. And in fact, it issues stock every so often, and you buy into the stock. It doesn't pay dividends. It's a thing one does for the city and the team. But having said that, I'm convinced that the fact that some corporation, some rich people could pick up a team from a community and move it somewhere, I'm convinced that that's what made me a socialist ultimately. Okay. In fact, I wrote a story about that for a baseball magazine, and the editor actually turned the issue of the magazine into, it was titled something like, I don't know, Capitalism in Baseball or something along those lines. And Eugene McCarthy, who ran for president, he's a senator from Minnesota, he also contributed a piece. My piece was given the section of the magazine, they called it "From the Story from Left Field" or something like that. But the title of the piece, and I'm sure you'll appreciate it, that I placed on it was "All That Is Solid Melts into Air." Okay. So anyhow, that's where it originates. I won't bother to go through the whole thing about the details as an adult, but I was in college in the late 60s. I was in graduate school in the 70s. It's a long story if I go through the details of it, but basically, I became a socialist. So, but Paine remained my hero, Thomas Paine.
Well, that's
that's more than you asked for. That's for sure.
No, but it's a fascinating political development story. But because we're still on Paine, and we're going to move forward with Paine, why don't we get into Paine in his life? What events and ideas influenced Paine's relatives and in turn Paine? For example, the English Revolution, the Levelers, the Society of Friends.
So, first thing to know, of course, is that Paine's parents were an unusual couple, an unusual marriage. His mother was an Anglican, Church of England. In this country, after the Revolution, and ultimately they became known as the Episcopal Church. Paine's father was a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends. So they had rather different understandings of God and such matters. And Paine's mother, literally, I mean, I think he memorized the Bible as a consequence of his mother. She was insistent that he study the Bible. His father, however, as a dissenter, I mean, a lot of people don't realize this because they only associate the Society of Friends with pacifism. The Society of Friends emerges in the course of the English Revolution of the 17th century, a revolution in which, as I used to tell my students, the English basically showed the French how to take off the head of a king. And so Paine's father, now we're talking 18th century, not the 17th century revolution, but Paine's father, even though he was pretty much ostracized by the Friends because he married an Anglican, it remained the case that he didn't give up his own beliefs and his own principles. And the assumption one has to make is that his father, in the course of Paine's, Paine did go to school. His parents were not well off, but there was an aunt who helped fund schooling. You had to pay for school, obviously, in those days. So in school, he had certain subjects he loved. The key thing is, at about the age of 13, I think it was, his parents could no longer afford to keep him in school. So they pulled him out and made him an apprentice to his father. His father was a stay maker, also known as a corset maker. It was not a career that Paine liked or enjoyed at all, but at least one can imagine that in the workshop, Paine's father must have talked to him about the Friends, or at least the principles that mattered to him, and perhaps even stories sort of personal stories, not that he had been in the revolution, that's a century ago, but rather the ways in which he knew of England and the politics of England. So one has to imagine that made a difference as a boy in his thinking. Okay. The other thing was that, which definitely influenced Paine's literary talents, is that when they had him in school, Paine's father was insistent that he not be in the track, so to speak. That would have included learning Latin or Greek, for that matter. And that saved Paine from becoming a fanciful writer. He would never write in foreign tongue, or he would never write in a way to impress other people. And the reason his father didn't want him to learn Latin is Latin was the language of the churches, and also quite often the language of law as it was applied, even though we're in England where the Catholic Church itself, had basically been thrown out. So one imagines that's the case. And from 13 to, say, 19, thereabouts, Paine worked as an apprentice. They did not make a great deal of money. Paine himself apparently did not appreciate being apprenticed to his father, but he also picked up a critical skill. He learned how to use his hands and fingers in creating these corsets for women. And at 19, thereabouts, maybe 20, he ran away from home. I mean, he's entitled to at that age. And he ran away and joined a privateer. A privateer was, of course, not a pirate, but it operated by law with authority from the crown. It was a private ship, but that operated with authority from the crown to attack the shipping of the enemy, which would have been, in most cases, say, the French at times or the Dutch, whatever, okay? And on board ship, where Paine learned how to fight, okay, and he also learned about getting along with very diverse people. These crews were made up of not only of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, you might say, but also of African Americans and others who had basically been recruited or enlisted, you might say. But Paine's skill as a corset maker served to make him a prized member of a crew because he could repair sails. And he spent a year they were quite successful in their voyage in privateering. But after about a year, Paine was smart enough to recognize that he was lucky to be alive. A year at war at sea. And he had money in his pocket as a consequence of the privateering. He came ashore and almost immediately went to London. And he's in London. He had this hunger for knowledge. Not everyone does, but he did. England had I mean, they had universities. Oxford and Cambridge and Scotland had universities. But it's the case you couldn't go to university unless you were already a member of the elite. Okay, and so, an aristocrat or sons of merchants, perhaps. You get the idea. And the other thing was, if you were in an English university, you could only study either theology or classics. Okay, so Paine himself didn't have a chance of going to university, but there was what we would call a kind of working class university in London. Artisans themselves were craft workers, and they had a fascination, a hunger almost for knowledge about the world, knowledge about their own craft and other crafts. So it was the case in London this would have been like the 1760s, maybe even sooner than that at first, where Paine has the money, he can afford not to work, and he spends his afternoons and or evenings when they're available attending lectures by well-known craftsmen and what we would today call scientists, men of letters, who would teach or offer lectures on astronomy or philosophy, whatever, to these artisans. And the artisans were autodidacts, you might say. They were educating themselves through these experiences. And Paine read a lot. He attended these things, and in that sense, he became himself in his own way a man of letters, even though it was not a university education or anything like that, but he was educated. He ran out of money eventually, which is not surprising if he's going to spend a year in taverns and coffee shops and in classes as such. So he returns to the trade he knew as a corset maker, as a stay maker, and he moves out of London to another town. And there he actually falls in love, marries, and this is important in his life because it transforms everything. The woman he falls in love with and whom he marries dies in childbirth. And he was devastated. And they had a very hard time economically. It really was a bad time for stay makers, corset makers. However, he and his wife had talked about her father's occupation. Her father had been an excise officer, which is basically a customs officer in one of the ports. And he returned to Thetford, where he was born. That's up in East Anglia, which is to the northeast of London. And his parents, took him back, and he studied for the excise officer's exam, and he passes, and he gets a commission as an excise officer. Now, excise officers were not always popular figures because their role was first of all, the role was to inspect cargoes, and once inspected, to stamp the cargoes. The other thing was that they would patrol, especially in certain parts of the country where he was posted. His job was to patrol the coast. It wasn't to patrol the coast in case of an invasion. The idea was that it was not unusual for coastal communities to set things up in the water to literally wreck shipping, with the idea that if it was wrecked, the cargo would float ashore. So some communities lived off of the wreckage. And a customs officer was there to find out where it was going, when it was happening, that kind of thing. Well, there was an incident that Paine was accused of what was called stamping, which meant not inspecting, simply stamping the cargo. And the story was, so they fired him. Or as the English say, they sacked him. But Paine must have known of his own innocence. I mean, he must have felt really aggrieved by what happened. And he petitioned for reinstatement. And apparently in the course of that investigation, it turned out that Paine was the fall guy, or he was set up by his supervisor. Now, it still took a while for him to get back into the excise commission's jobs. But in the meantime, he became, for a while, a tutor, not a teacher, a tutor of well-off people's kids. He spent time on Sundays. It's said that he would go to Methodist meetings, which were often open-air meetings, and he'd do preaching, at least as a way of getting food. He'd be that way. But for a while he was literally living almost hand to mouth, or occasionally if he was making money as a tutor. But when he got reinstated, he lucked out. He got assigned to Lewes, which is a town on the south coast of England, a really nice really nice town. And there he happened to live with a tobacconist who had a shop. And this man took a real liking to Paine and started to introduce him to other proprietors on the high street, or Main Street, as they say. They call it a high street. And he began to attend meetings of a group called I just blanked. You know the name, quick, I bet. It was at the White Hart Tavern, the Headstrong Club. The Headstrong Club. There it is. And the Headstrong Club would meet once or twice a week over dinner and eating and drinking. And the task was for them to they were going to talk about current affairs, you might say. But Paine came to have a reputation as being really good with words. Okay, really good with words. And how do we know that? Because apparently there was a book, the Headstrong Club book. It was like a record of the events of the group. And the winner of any week, the recognized master of words that week, would get to take home the book, and it would be recorded in the book. So he became fairly well respected in the community. He also was known as a really fabulous ice skater. That's well before the age of global warming. So, streams and other little bodies of water would freeze up. So good that I think they called him something like the commander, because he would just command the ice. His talent with words spread, the knowledge of that, and the other excise officers, they weren't closely situated, but the word spread, and the excise officers, who by the way were not paid very well, and what little they were paid they had to use to cover the expenses of their own horse and things like that. But the excise officers gathered somehow and decided they were going to petition the Excise Commission and Parliament to get their wages raised. Now, that was illegal. That was like organizing a union, which was utterly illegal. It was, like a combination. People weren't supposed to combine together to make these kinds of demands. Well, Paine's talent with words led them to say, Thomas, you do it. You should write this and take the petition to London, which he did. And it's actually usually found in collections of his writings. It's called The Case of the Excise Officers. And it's not nearly as good as later writings like Common Sense and the other pamphlets, but it already shows how smart he was, the way he phrased it and the way he laid it out, the argument. The problem was that he wasn't supposed to be in London. He was supposed to be down on the South Coast. So while he's in London, he's meeting important people, trying to persuade them to lobby. In essence, he's a labor union, a labor representative, and a lobbyist at this point. And by the way, among the people he meets is Benjamin Franklin, who is probably the best known figure in the Atlantic world. And of course, and this is now we're in the 1770s, early 1770s. And Franklin had a task, he set himself. He was going to find men who he wanted to encourage to go to America, which was entering into a rebellion. It was in rebellion already. So Paine himself was no radical at this time. His ideas were of a liberal kind of sort. The Excise Commission, in short, discovers that he's been absent without leave, and they sack him again. Franklin encourages Paine to go to America. He's already now late 30s, maybe 37 years of age. Paine returns to Lewes, closes up his affairs. By the way, along the way, the tobacconist had passed away, and Paine married his daughter because he owed the man so much. Paine and this woman separate. He heads to America. And by the way, it's known that whenever he did have money, he sent money to her brother for her to live comfortably with the brother, just for the record. So Paine heads to America in the autumn of 1774. I'm probably leaving out a lot of good stuff, but it doesn't matter. Okay. He arrives in Philadelphia and he is ill. He's picked up ship's fever, I don't know, typhus. He could easily have died en route to America. He arrives in Philadelphia and is brought off the boat on a stretcher. And they find a room for him in, townhouse there in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, this is notable, was a city of 30,000 and essentially 1 square mile. 1 square mile. When Paine recovers from the ship's fever and he heads out around Philadelphia, he in some ways he falls in love with this little city. It has bookstores, it has coffee shops, it has men. But here's the key thing. Let's put this in context. When he arrives in America, America is in the colonies, the 13 colonies. He realizes that it's not simply a state of rebellion. What he recognizes is that the Americans themselves don't realize that they've staged a revolution already. Because in the wake, okay, now we have to back up again. Okay. Late 1773, the Boston Tea Party. 1774, the imposition of they're called the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts. Basically, Massachusetts, Boston are under siege. They're occupied by it's occupied by British troops. Well, as a consequence of correspondence societies and other kinds of media that we would call social media of the day, north to south, the other colonies, or at least the more rebellious figures in the colonies, they begin to throw out British authorities, so that the 13 colonies truly in a state of rebellion, where they've essentially thrown out British authority. Now they haven't declared independence. Their goal is to have Britain recognize that they too are British, and thus therefore entitled to the rights of freeborn Englishmen, as it was said, which was not a case of democracy itself, nor was it a case of independence. But what is essential to realize is, essentially Americans had set up committees in all these towns and cities to self-govern. I mean, it's a fascinating thought that, anarchists love it, okay, because it's self-governance. Now, the best thing to read, and I only discovered it after I wrote the Thomas Paine book, is a speech by Edmund Burke, the foremost conservative. He's the father of modern political conservatism, Edmund Burke. He's an Anglo-Irish member of Parliament. In March of 1775, Burke gives a speech. March of 75. He gives a speech in Parliament, and he warns his fellow parliamentarians that they should be careful about how they pursue the suppression of this rebellion in America. He's convinced that it's this close. Sorry, I'm sure if people are watching, it's like my thumb and my pointer finger are not too far apart. He believes that the Americans have already staged a revolution and don't realize it, which is what Paine came to see when he arrives. And what he says is, don't make Americans aware of what they have done and are capable of doing. And he warns that this is not simply a matter of losing the colonies. He's afraid that if Americans rise up in the way that they could easily then be pushed to do, that it will set an example for Europeans and the British themselves, and there would be this revolution, this sort of revolutionary spirit in Europe. That's what he's afraid of. So people often say that Burke was a friend of the American Revolution. He was not a friend of the American Revolution. It was that the fear he had led him to be sympathetic to the demands of the colonists. Okay? And then Paine, as he discovers America, and he falls in love with it. The only thing that really shocked him was the persistence of slavery in the colonies. Here are all these people talking about freedom and liberty, and meanwhile, slavery persists. And one of his first writings, which I think you referred to in that episode you did on Paine, notes the fact that he wrote against slavery and called for the end of slavery himself. And it's that, by the way, that article that brings him to the attention of Benjamin Rush. Let me point out, he ends up getting the job, which he never, ever would have expected. But he has an introduction from Franklin that he can keep in his back pocket. And he becomes the editor of a brand new magazine in Philadelphia called the Pennsylvania Magazine, which itself becomes it becomes the most widely circulated magazine in the colonies. Its subscriptions aren't in the thousands, but men of importance get it, and they share these things back in those days. So anyhow, Paine is contacted. Well, Paine is contacted by Benjamin Rush, who's a young, relatively radical doctor, who's a member of the Continental Congress, good friends with the likes of Adams and Jefferson. His friends with these guys. And Rush seeks out Thomas Paine because he wants to know who's this man who's written this thing on, about slavery. And then also because now we've got on April 19, there's the famous shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord. Paine at this point is all the more now radicalized, the violence of Lexington and Concord. So Rush meets with him, and Rush, recognizing Paine's talent as a writer and also his developing radicalism, actually proposes to Paine that he write a pamphlet calling for separation from Britain and the creation of a republic. But he also tells Paine, don't use the word separation or republic. And Paine probably sat there thinking, you guys ever use 4-letter words on this podcast? I won't if you don't want me to. Don't. Oh, it's okay? Okay. Paine probably said to himself, what the fuck is going on here? This guy is this supposedly radical member of the Continental Congress, and he's telling me to write a pamphlet about separation and creating a republic, and I'm not supposed to use those words. There's a line in Common Sense in which Paine refers to the timidity of wealthy people. Okay, and I'm always convinced that line is instigated by this moment. Well, Rush himself was a radical, there's no question. But Paine says to him, and by the way, we know of this conversation, they had become friendly, not from Paine. Paine doesn't recount this story. It's Rush who recounts this story in his own diaries. And Rush says, Paine said, well, why don't you write this, basically? And Rush says, I can't write it. I have too much to lose. You don't have much to lose, so you should be the one to write it. So Paine, for better or worse at the moment, decides he's going to do it. And in upcoming months, he starts collecting materials. He talks to other members of the Continental Congress and so on. And what results is, of course, in January of 1776, the publication of a pamphlet of fewer than 50 pages entitled Common Sense. And and let me say to people right now, who are listening or watching us, this is the most revolutionary document in modern history. Why? Well, in part because of the impact it had on world history, specifically American, but then on world history. The other thing is there's a line which Paine adds to the second edition that results a couple of weeks later, and it's in the appendix. And in the appendix, the line is, and a lot of people probably know of it, I'm sure you guys know of it, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. Can you think about how we live in the 21st century. We know that human agency can do incredible things for better or worse. But that line, we have it in our power to begin the world over again, was unprecedented in literary work, to my knowledge. Okay, with all due respect to Marx's later, Communist Manifesto, it's the case that this pamphlet is literally, to me, the beginning of the modern world by way of that idea of what humanity and solidarity can create or can bring about. So this pamphlet itself opens. Sorry, I should stop because I'm sure you want to ask questions. But all I was going to say is what's interesting about this pamphlet that's known as the pamphlet that first called for American independence. A lot of people wrote pamphlets, but they didn't have the audacity or literally the insights to call for a revolution. What Paine does in Common Sense is he turns the American rebellion, which itself was revolutionary, but the Americans didn't call it that themselves. He turns a rebellion into a revolution, because what he does, metaphorically speaking, is if he holds up a mirror to Americans and says, look what you've done and look what you're capable of accomplishing. And the other thing is that what makes it truly revolutionary is not the call for independence. Paine himself wrote later that if it was simply a matter of independence, it wouldn't have been worth doing. What made it is that this struggle becomes a revolution for democracy, the creation of a democratic republic. And, the pamphlet itself begins not with any call for independence. It begins with a very democratic story, a story of supposed origins of a people, and then goes on to berate the British political system, top to bottom, king to parliament and the whole imperial order, and then goes on to talk about what it means to be an American, and then goes on basically to say, maybe what we need is a plan. And given the title of your podcast, it's that plan which probably caught your attention. He says what we need is a charter, which is another word for constitution. And the revolution is thus, the rebellion, I should say, is turned into a revolution. And then I'll stop there. Okay.
There's so much there. One, thinking about the ideas that influenced him, and we don't have to go back to that, but the Friends, the Quakers being interesting. I only knew about the Friends because my mom actually went to the only Friends school in Maryland.
Oh, really? No kidding. Where was it located? Was it Baltimore? Where was it?
It would have been in Baltimore. Yeah, it was called the Baltimore Friends.
Okay.
And there were some pretty radical folks who taught her there. But then also thinking about, you mentioned E.P. Thompson earlier, and I was revisiting his book, the Making of the English Working Class.
Right.
And so much of that book, when I read it the first time, I didn't appreciate how much of that book involves Tom Paine.
Yeah, that whole section called Rights of Man. Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. And a lot of that book is about how there are these underlying ideas, radical democratic ideas that are suppressed, but are there beneath the surface and coming up in these discussion circles, essentially.
Yeah, I guess, I forgot to talk about the Wilkes and Liberty movements that Paine would have witnessed in London while he was living there. The English themselves, the rights of the freeborn Englishman did not include democratic rights, the right to vote and all of that. And only those with property or who paid a certain amount of tax were entitled to vote. And it basically meant that only one of every 20 men in England could vote. So there was a tradition in England of working people expressing, and even middle-class people who didn't have the right to vote, expressing themselves politically through crowd actions. Okay, crowd actions. And the crowd actions could turn violent or they might stay merely peaceful. The point is, it was called politics out of doors. But there was a politics the elites couldn't quite ignore because it expressed basically the spirit of working people. And there were other occasions when the economy might, be in bumpy times where women themselves, as in politics, outdoor politics, would go into the market square and take over the market. This was, they called that, there's a name for it, the moral economy. The moral economy. That is, if prices were going up too high, that was immoral. And they would literally take over the shops and stalls and sell the goods at a moral price, they would say. So there was these traditions, and Paine was witness to that. So when he arrives in America, and Americans were full of crowd activity, Philadelphia and all these cities, that's how that original rebellion that Paine didn't witness, but saw the results of by way of these committees that were formed to take over the town and govern the economic and political life. That was a tradition that was brought from England, basically. And that clearly influenced Paine's own thinking about the possibilities that ordinary people didn't need kings, or aristocrats or overlords in any sense. They could govern themselves, that they could govern the world.
So you talked a little bit about common sense and did a great job introducing that, and then brought up Paine's democratic ideas. One book that Lucas and I have been influenced by, and I think is very intriguing, is Jonathan Israel's book, The Expanding Blaze. And one thing
I know of the book, but I will be honest, I may have only read parts of it as part of.
That's okay. I think I think the question will still make sense. One of the things that stands out is he looks at everything that's going on in America post revolution, and more or less places folks either in an aristocratic Republican schema or a democratic Republican schema. And I think one thing that's interesting is to acknowledge, okay, pretty much everyone, dare I say everyone, is a Republican in the sense that they don't want a king. But then there are degrees of democracy within that.
Absolutely.
So curious, what distinguishes Paine's, I think it'd be correct to call him a democratic Republican, what distinguishes his republicanism in the context of sort of everyone's Republican?
I would go so far as to argue that if you're going to, those terms are not my terms, but they're useful. I mean, I would have talked about elite Republicans versus sort of democratic, small d democratic. But I got the idea, and you guys will understand what I'm saying. Paine, in many ways, is the father of democratic republicanism, to use his terminology. Not Paine's, but Jonathan Israel's terminology. Here, let's talk about some of the figures involved to explain what that meant. And let's go back into the revolution itself. When Common Sense was published in January of 1976, John Adams bought, I think, 3 copies. 1 for himself, and 2 he sent up to Abigail Adams in Quincy, near Boston. And when she receives it, Abigail, she says, she assumes that John may have been the author of it. May have been the author of it. He doesn't hear from her quickly enough. I mean, you're talking about sending a letter from from Philadelphia up to Boston. And in the intervening time, I believe their letters cross. In any case, she writes, without his knowing, that having read the pamphlet, that she's wondering if this is his writing. She then says that if this should come to pass, this struggle for independence and the making of a republic, then she warns him, remember the ladies. There's a famous line. Well, everybody learns this line in the course of high school these days, I think. And then she goes, and if you don't remember the ladies, we will come to Philadelphia and stage our own revolution. Adams receives this letter and writes back to her, and he makes it very clear, I am not the author of the pamphlet. I'm not. He actually says, their letters are wonderful to read, by the way. He says, I could not write in so manly a fashion. And what he means by that kind of vigorous argument for, and he even goes on to say, but of course the author knows how to pull things down. He doesn't know how to build things up, which is because Adams does not like the fact that Paine has called not only for independence, but for a democratic republic. And what does that mean? Adams was a Republican. He had little doubt that they should declare independence and create a republic. However, as much as Adams hated the idea of aristocracy, he feared common people. He feared working people. So how could you create a republic? And he's not alone in this thinking. Without republicanism is fascinating in its own way. It's kind of like Marxism of the 18th century, because it had its own. In fact, it had its own dialectic built into it. Because if you read the Republican argument, and you could easily breathe in a democratic spirit, even though it's not intended, okay, until you get to, well, how do we set up a government that way? And then you realize what they're talking about is, well, we'll only have people of property. Or, no, we'll only have people who are educated. Whatever, you get the idea. So, in fact, there's a great story. Adams went to the barber to get a shave. And the barber says to him, have you read Common Sense? And Adams says, oh, yes, of course. He goes, well, tonight we're going to meet at the tavern and we're going to read aloud from Common Sense. And you can almost imagine, I don't know for a fact, but you can almost imagine that here's the barber with his blade, right? Shaving Adam's neck, and Adam's saying to himself, is this barber going to slit my throat? Something, which was probably never never going to happen in any case. But it's that kind of thing, that class question emerges. So again, I don't think, and by the way, Adams isn't the worst of the bunch. Think about the likes of Gouverneur Morris, who was this wealthy merchant and lawyer who hated Thomas. Some of these guys hated the fact that it was Paine who took the leap of faith in calling for independence and the creation of a democratic republic. And sometimes later they got even with Paine for having done so. But that's the French Revolution side of the story. So it had to do with who would be not just a citizen, but to use the French terminology, an active citizen versus the passive citizen.
Harvey, could you talk about what was Paine's theory of natural rights?
Well, I'm not so sure it was that radically different from anyone else who argued for that. The idea was that by your very existence, you are endowed, and Paine was a deist, not an atheist. So this would have been the idea for him that God had endowed people with rights, certain natural rights. And to really understand natural rights, you can get into the whole thing about natural rights, and I'm not a specialist on that kind of question. But it's interesting. Paine eventually had to distinguish between natural rights and civil rights. And he said natural rights always adhere to your very existence, to your very being. But civil rights are their best way of putting it is to make real and practical the natural rights. Because so you have a right to speech. That's a natural right. Think of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, right? Freedom of how's it go? Separation. It has to do basically with freedom of conscience, okay, and freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly with the right to petition. Freedom of conscience and freedom of speech would be considered natural rights, and so too the others, given the way that they're articulated in the Constitution as the part of the Bill of Rights. So they're natural rights. But then the question arises, well, if it's true, freedom of conscience, then does that mean that any church could be established, that any set of beliefs could be established? Does it freedom of speech? Does it mean you get to say whatever you want, wherever you want? Well, that becomes a question then of civil rights, of how they can be practiced. Okay, because the other thing is that Paine would say you can exercise your natural rights as long as you don't hurt your fellows, right? This is important for common sense, what I just mentioned, because people love to refer to Jefferson's remark about separation of church and state, okay? And as well as Washington's having been so keen to make sure all churches were that regardless of your faith, you were included inside of the American polity and people. But people don't recognize that it's in common sense. You can have somebody read Common Sense and not even recognize something which is stated several times. Paine is absolute about the question of freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom, okay? Absolute. And he offers the best statement of what we think of as separation of church and state. When Jefferson writes, build a wall between church and state, Paine's already said, and keep in mind, when Paine writes it, it's what literally enables certain communities in the colonies to enter the revolution itself. And I'll explain to you what I mean. So the favorite line of the many is, the only business that the state would have in religion is to make sure everyone gets to practice it as they please. I'm paraphrasing. Now, that's separate church and state. Let's go down to Virginia. There's an area of Virginia, which today is, by the way, votes heavily for Trump. It's sort of southwest of D.C., out beyond Arlington and the area that's turned blue to vote. in those communities out there, these are farmers, and many of them are not Anglicans. The Anglican Church is the established church in Virginia, and you've got Jefferson was brought up in the Anglican Church, Washington, and the others. But by the way, all of the famous founders, essentially all of them, were deists. They believed that God created the earth and the heavens, but that he didn't interfere because, as they would say, if God is perfect, he would have created a perfect order, and there would have been no need to go and mess around with it, that kind of thing. That's in the simplest terms. Well, some of these farming communities had moved away from the established church and become Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist. And their concern about the American rebellion, should it move beyond that to the question of independence, was, well, wait a minute, if that happens, are we going to end up with a state of Virginia that has an established church and maybe even a bishop? There were no bishops in the colonies from the Anglican churches, but there were established churches in parts of the colonies. So in New England, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, for example, the established church was the Congregational Church. Down south, it was quite usual that the established church would be the Anglicans. However, when they read Common Sense and they saw Paine's argument that this new nation, this new country, would not enforce, but would create separation of church and state, they then joined the revolutionary cause. So it's from the very beginning, the idea of separation of church and state. And keep in mind what I just told you. That meant that what we would today think of as Baptists, the last thing they wanted was an established church. Today, it's the Baptists themselves who want to, all too often, want to impose their own beliefs on entire communities and entire, regions of the country. But they were so inspired by Paine's writings that gave them that additional impulse to join the revolution.
Do you? I don't know the answer. I don't know if you do. Do you know where Paine is getting that idea of, you can do what you want to do so long as it doesn't harm other people?
That's a very good question. Do I know where he got it?
Or where?
Yeah,
where,
well, maybe it's a variation, a step beyond perhaps the fundamental idea of do unto others as you would have others do unto you.
Right.
Okay, I think that might well be the source of it. Okay, I mean, by the way, his desire to see separation of church and state had to do with his own experience in England. The fact that in 18th century England, when and where he grew up, the Anglican Church, you had to be an Anglican, say, to go to university. You had to be an Anglican to vote. I mean, if you were a Methodist, which was really a kind of movement within the Anglican Church, but it was separatist in its own fashion. If you're a Methodist or a Baptist or Jewish or Catholic or Presbyterian, you were not a full citizen. You did not have the rights of others. And it was known as, basically, you were tolerated. By the way, he also despises the term, he didn't like tolerate. He didn't think, it was not a matter of toleration. It was a matter of you were equal and you had the same rights as everyone else, as he saw it America would come to be. Because toleration means that the person who is doing the tolerating has power and authority over you.
That's really interesting. I mean, that's a whole other concept, I guess, this idea of having control over other people, domination, so on and so forth. What that
I remember growing up with teachers and others talking about toleration, it sounds, and for kids, it's important, toleration. Okay. So I shouldn't do this or that, but it's also the case that it empowers you or authorizes you in some ways to put up with other people's, whereas what they should have been talking about is equal rights, and you have no right to do these things, even if you have the right to say what you want or whatever else. Anyhow. Yeah.
So at this point, in our story, Paine travels to Britain. This is after the Revolutionary War.
Right.
And he publishes The Rights of Man. And that's actually where I didn't know that Edmund Burke makes sense now, but that Edmund Burke was much of a person prior to,
Right.
prior to
Yeah.
writing what Paine is responding to in Rights of Man.
Yeah. So Burke writes Reflections on the Revolution in France.
Right.
And by the way, just for the record, I was listening to your podcast, and this is everyone thinks Paine was defending the French Revolution. Paine was defending the American and French Revolution. Paine himself had come to see Burke as something of a friend of the American cause. For what it's worth, I don't think he knew of that speech that Burke had given. Okay, and so when he writes, he's defending the American Revolution and the French Revolution, because he sees Burke's attack on the French Revolution as fundamentally an attack on the American Revolution and the United States, and because now the United States is a separate country. But it is obviously the most clearly an attack on the French Revolution, given at the timing of it, and the fact that it's talking about how dare they, right?
So, 2 questions about the Rights of Man. I mean, it's a giant question.
Okay.
One, just what stands out about it, but I think folks might know a little bit about the book already, maybe less about who is influenced by this book, who's reading it, what ideas are they taking away from it.
On a grand scale, on both a small and a grand scale, it's really standing on the shoulders of the pamphlet Common Sense. I mean, it opens really with a discussion of the fact that it's almost, people must go and read these things. I insist. But the point is, it opens up with the fact that, how can you move the world? How can you change the world? Okay. I mean, we all know that in order to move an object, right, you need a lever. You got to move it has to, what's the old thing? It's an object in, come on, quick, remind me from physics.
An object in motion won't
stationary
stop.
object, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, must be acted upon by another object or force, right? So what Paine explains in that opening paragraph says, when people say, how do we lift up the world? How do we transform the world? Paine says, America has shown it. In essence, the American Revolution is the lever. We now know it can be done. And he goes on to talk, basically he's repeating the arguments in the first part of, it's 2 pamphlets. In the first part, they're lengthy pamphlets, which is why you and others, and I would too, would say in the book. Okay. He's arguing against royalty, against aristocracy. He's arguing basically that working people, common folk, can govern themselves. They don't need all this, right, this royal rule and aristocratic authority. They just don't need it. And in fact, not only that, it's bloody, it's violent, it creates wars, it wreaks havoc upon people's lives. But Paine then also says, just imagine, now he's talking to the Brits, just imagine what we could accomplish if we didn't have the expenses of running a king and an aristocracy. Because the king and the aristocracy, they lived off, I mean, that's an original form of exploitation. They were living off of the taxes and labors of working people. And he actually says, well, just if we could, basically, he doesn't, by the second copy, the second edition of the second volume of Rights of Man, he makes it pretty clear that this is a call for revolution. And what he says is, think of what we could accomplish. He basically argues we could end poverty. That's his proposal. How can we do that? Well, with the monies we save, we could create we could create vouchers for kids to be able to go to school. We could set up what later would be called employment agencies. We could provide monies to people in need. I mean, he's beginning to call, and this is why, I tried to avoid it often telling people this because you don't want to scare them with Thomas Paine. But Paine is actually the father of social democracy, because his proposals in Rights of Man and later in Agrarian Justice is really the sort of origins of the very idea of social democracy. So Rights of Man becomes this bestseller ever in Europe. I mean, really, it's incredible. And moreover, why is it that important? Paine is already a known name in many quarters of Europe because Common Sense should have said this. when it appears in Philadelphia, it's almost overnight, it gets translated into German. Philadelphia must have had 1/4 of its population were German immigrants. So almost immediately it gets translated into German, placed on ships bound for Hamburg, gets unloaded. And by the way, ever since the American Revolution, right through a good part of the 19th century, especially inspiring to the 1848 radicals and revolutionaries, people believe that America is what Paine envisioned. So Paine's name is significant to literate, to readers of liberal and radical ideas. It becomes a huge bestseller, and Rights of Man too is translated into all these many languages. It's, in one sense, it's important because, keep in mind, the European continent, as well as the British Isles, these are empires, multinational empires. So, if you read this, you can envision independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If you're Irish, sure as hell you can envision this as a call for separation. The Scots loved it. So the popularity had to do with, one, Paine's name, number two, the fact that it was really, in its own way, a new common sense, and three, it was both a reference to the American independence struggle, but also as well struggles from the bottom up that could transform these aristocratic orders into far more Republican and democratic orders. Does that answer get to your question? Good. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm ready for any question you want.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, as we get to this point where we are now, maybe you could talk about Paine's lasting legacy, going into where we are now, but through the legacy
right.
of
yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
Let me tell you. I'll tell it in the form of a personal story. Okay. Sure. So I've already told you, ever since I was 10 years old, knowledgeable or not of what I was reading, Paine was my hero. And I do recall that I remember watching the Republican convention of 1980 when Ronald Reagan accepts the Republican nomination, and he quoted three figures of American history: Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln, and FDR. Okay, I won't get into the full story about that, but I remember being shocked and pissed off that Ronald Reagan was quoting the radical Democrat, the revolutionary Thomas Paine. How dare a conservative do that kind of thing? Well, when I eventually later decided I was going to write the book Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, and I know based on what you referred to, my first book on Paine was actually a young adult biography of Thomas Paine. Later, I decided I didn't want to give my man up so readily. I decided I was going to write another book on Paine. But my idea was not to write a biography of Paine. One, because I had already done that for young adults, and also because the works by, I just blanked on their names, but there were two very good biographies of Paine that came out in the early 90s. One by an American, I've got it sitting back there somewhere, and another one by a Canadian who was an academic in England. So I wasn't going to repeat what they did. But I had the idea that I wanted to tell the story of the suppression of Thomas Paine's memory. So I got a contract to do that. And then I went into the library at my university, and I walked the aisles of the American history section. And I just grabbed biographies of famous Americans and lesser known Americans, but biographies. And I looked in the index in every book. And what shocked me was that for a man who was supposedly forgotten, he somehow was getting a reference in all of these biographies, right? I mean, all the way through. And I thought, wait a minute, what's going on here? And the more I did my research, the more I looked into it and deeply into it, I realized that we all had the story wrong. Yes, Paine's memory, as far as the elites were concerned, how did I put it? The powerful, the property, the prestigious, and the pious, they all wanted to suppress Paine's memory. The problem is they repeatedly failed to do so. because in every generation from the revolution, post-revolution, all the way through the 19th century, into the 20th century, every single liberal, progressive, radical, socialist, you name it, every single movement to transform America for the better, in my terms, had laid hold of Thomas Paine's story, and especially his writings, and made him and his work part of their own movement, either as a figure that they would champion, or, rights, whether it was Common Sense, Rights of Man, his later writings, The Age of Reason, Agrarian Justice. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe what I was discovering. And I remember I had this conversation with Eric Foner, and I said, Eric, I think we're all wrong. I said, I know you've acknowledged a bit of this, but Paine's memory was never forgotten. I mean, I could look, the working men's movement of the early 19th century, the abolitionists, the women's rights movement, the labor movement around the time of the Civil War and ever after, the populists, the progressives, the socialists, the anarchists. Every single time it was. I've tried to get rid of some of it, but I have these tubs, these plastic tubs you pick up in the discount stores, filled with primary evidence of Paine's importance to these groups in every generation. And what it also taught me is just how dynamic the American radical story is. So that, literally was floored when I kept uncovering material. In fact, after the book was published in 2005, I discovered that I had missed out on something really interesting. There were occasions when African Americans did grab hold of Paine through American history, but the civil rights movement, I found no evidence of it. That they and I figured out, well, so much of the civil rights movement was church-based, and Paine had been attacked over and over again for his own writings, like The Age of Reason, which attacked organized religion. Okay, Paine was not an atheist; he was a deist, but nevertheless, he became known as an atheist for his attack on organized religion. But then I discovered, and I keep it also very close, that Martin Luther King Jr. made it a point of turning to Paine's writings whenever he was despondent, whenever he thought that the cause was somehow stymied. And this, what turned out is that there was a line, and they're in two of his writings. He turned in particular to Paine's Common Sense, and the line, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." Somehow that line re-inspired Martin Luther King Jr. when he was despondent. And so, I can now say every single progressive, in the broadest sense, progressive movement in American history, rediscovered by the way, Paine's writings were never out of print in the United States, however much the property, powerful, pious, and the prestigious would have loved to have seen it forgotten completely. It even included not just people from Abraham Lincoln was a Paineite. Okay. FDR, this is interesting. Teddy Roosevelt wrote a biography of that Gouverneur Morris. We didn't get into all that, but wrote a biography. Gouverneur Morris was really a shit during the French Revolution. But Roosevelt had a line in the biography of Morris where he says, Paine was a filthy little atheist. Decades later, let's see, so that would have been like 30 years later, something like that, 40 years later, FDR is the first president since Jefferson. Well, first president, I think, since Washington or Jefferson, to quote Thomas Paine in a presidential speech. In fact, I'm not even sure Jefferson ever did it in a presidential speech, in spite of the fact that Jefferson and Paine were very, very close. And FDR uses Paine at critical moments during the early years of World War II. The letters to the White House in response to the speech in which FDR quotes Paine, one of them includes this guy says, I think it's from Kansas or somewhere, he says, how wonderful it is that another Roosevelt should refer to Paine and disprove the way in which the first Roosevelt, to paraphrase, shat upon Thomas Paine. Okay. He doesn't say the word, but I just shorthanded it. So.
Well, that's fascinating about the civil rights movement, because your book really stands out for tracing Paine through all of those movements, all the ones you mentioned. I suppose I'd only add the New Left. I think you referenced C. Wright Mills, Tom
C. Wright
Paine.
Mills, absolutely. In fact, he was when he had been. I mean, he was an academic sociologist at Columbia University, but in the '60s, when he turned to writing shorter books, these were pamphlets in a way, and the whole idea of pamphleteering he got from Thomas Paine. Although one thing Mills said was that we can no longer depend on pamphlets necessarily because we're overwhelmed by advertising. We have to find other ways of connecting. But the pamphlets were Mills' way of doing so. The Causes of World War III. Too many years since I was teaching that stuff. I can't remember all the titles right now. But I also want to point out the reason that Reagan pissed me off so much is that for 200 years, conservatives really had done everything to suppress Paine's memory. And here's Reagan, who, by the way, has started out an FDR Democrat in his politics back in the 1930s and 40s. He hijacks Paine to support his creation, in many ways, of this new right national politics. The new right had been formed. Reagan harnesses the new right as his political force. And what does he do? By the way, he must have shot the shit out of conservatives when he quoted Paine, because, in fact, George Will, the foremost conservative columnist of the last 40 years in America, George Will actually wrote a column following the speech, the delivery of the speech, in which he said, basically, how dare Ronald Reagan quote Thomas Paine and not Edmund Burke in his speech? Yeah. But it also shows you how little a lot of people know history. Reagan later quoted Thomas Paine to the National Association of Evangelicals, who were meeting in Disney World in Florida, and he got away with it. In fact, a number of the evangelicals later themselves quoted Thomas Paine in their books. So, whatever.
Well,
Paine was with us all the way through.
Yeah. This has been it's always an enlightening story time and like conversation to go through Thomas Paine's life, but also, I mean, certainly his life. I don't think we've ever talked so much about his life, but even just the lasting legacy that he provides everybody else through their kind of political journey.
Right. Well, it turned my book, actually, it's funny, with all the books I've done, the book that, in quotes, sold the most, remains the most active, so to speak, is that book on Thomas Paine. Mostly because I think it is that story. I tell people I've retold the American story by way of Thomas Paine's legacy. That was my ultimate project.
Luke, if you have any other last questions, you want to ask Harvey?
Yeah. I was reading your book, Firebrand of the Revolution. I think
that was for the young adult book. Right. Yeah. And by the way, can I brag I'll just brag.
Please.
That won the New York Public Library Award for Best Book for Teenagers when it came out, which, by the way, it was so much fun to do that book because it's the first book I ever did where the publisher really went out and they actually illustrated it. I only wish they were willing to illustrate it with some color photos, but they couldn't. So they had the black and whites of the paintings and black and whites of the photos. But it was so much fun to write that book. That's a story in itself, and if I started to tell you, it would take too long.
Oh, a story for another time. It's a wonderful book. I encourage folks to check it out. And so this question that I have, it's a little long. It draws on a few things.
Okay.
So, I picked up that book, and I had a particular Tom Paine quote in mind. I forget what Tom Paine biography it is. There's some that there's one of them that has several quotes on the very back of the book. I think that was where I first read this quote. I'll read it just real quick here for our audience. It's a quote that says, "When it shall be said in our country, when it shall be said, in any country in the world, my poor are happy, neither ignorance or distress is to be found among them. My jails are empty of prisoners, my streets of beggars, the aged are not in want, the taxes are not oppressive, When all those things can be said, then may that country boast of its constitution and of its government.
Right.
Yeah. So I had that. I love that quote. I have that quote floating around in my head. I pick up, your book and I read it and so on and so forth. And at the end, I believe there's a picture of a U.S. World War II bomber.
Oh, yes. Right.
And it's
Right.
named
That's
after,
the young adult book. Right. Yeah.
yeah, and it's named after Tom Paine. And then you
Right.
also say that units of the 8th Air Force drew support from Paine. And I guess
Yes.
they actually made a plaque that
Yes.
says, this simple son of England lives on through the ideas and
That's right.
principles of the democratic world, so on and so forth. So I had this thought. It's like, okay.
I will answer. I hold the question one thought, just so
Sure,
people understand.
Yeah.
The 8th Air Force was stationed in East Anglia in England, not far, and there were bases throughout East Anglia, which is where Thomas Paine was born and grew up, East Anglia. And so it's in Thetford, the town of Thetford, where he was. There's actually a statue to Paine there, which I believe was paid for by pilots, airmen of the 8th Air Force. So they came to be aware of Paine, probably maybe in some other way, but they realized that they were stationed there near Paine's home. Okay.
So I'll be honest, I had this thought. It was the same thought I had, when they named, I think, an aircraft carrier or something after John Lewis. I had this thought of, if Paine were alive today, what would he say about that? And then extrapolating, what would he say about America? What would he say about our Constitution? Can people who are flying World War II bombers so easily name it after Tom Paine?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, which is a sign of your generational historical ignorance.
Oh, okay, please. Yeah,
okay?
Yeah.
I don't mean to insult you. It sounds insulting, but I'm often amazed at how the distance from World War II has kind of faded in your generation's minds. Here's the thing.
Sure.
When these guys went in the air, they were attacking Nazi Germany. Okay. If there was any obvious evil in the world that Paine would have been happy to enlist in himself, I mean, it would have been that cause, right? So Paine was not a pacifist. He didn't believe in violence for violence sake. He opposed the death penalty, for example, even in his day. But it is the case that there are causes that demand military action. Okay. And he would have been honored by that particular fact, I believe, of that plane. There might even have been some transport ship that was named after him during the war as well. During World War II, one of the initiatives was to make sure that soldiers, sailors, and airmen and Marines would have access to books at a very low price. And so there was an organization set up with government support to provide cheap paperbacks that were not made available at the same time in the United States. This is for the sake of people carrying it in, for lack of a better way of putting it, carrying it into the service or into combat. And among those, I believe, were Thomas Paine's writings. So that meant they were. Plus, there was this you might enjoy. There's a novelist, Howard Fast, who wrote a biographical novel of Thomas Paine. Now, Howard Fast was a communist, and it was called Citizen Paine or something to that effect. I do believe that novel of his, which was a bestseller in its day, was also in the backpacks of guys fighting in Europe and possibly the Pacific themselves. So yeah, I don't see any kind of contradiction between Paine going into war against fascism ever. Okay.
What do you think?
Which is different than if you told me that they named the B-1 bomber after Thomas Paine.
Okay.
Or for that matter, that the what's it called, not the Gulf War, the war in Iraq was named Operation Paine, something like that. Well, that would have worked if you left the E off. That would have been Operation Paine for sure. So
if I can just add in one more thing, I recently wrote something about the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to respond. This one, I have a story to tell you.
Okay. Excellent. And, they, well, I'll just put my opinion out there. They call the Constitution the greatest written document to human freedom in human history,
Yes.
something like that. Okay. My thought is
not okay, but I'm with you. Go ahead.
Well, okay. Okay. In the sense of they did that.
Yeah.
Lucas and I talk about this. This is what the blog is about. Oof, that's a tough position to take right now. We feel like there are a lot of problems with the Constitution, people talking about, how it needs to change, so on and so forth. But the National Constitution Center has, I think it's correct to say, a serviceable biography on their website of Tom Paine. And they also have a page about the Pennsylvania Constitution, which, we didn't talk about the Pennsylvania Constitution, but that, was influenced by Paine. And they call it, an immensely radical document. So I looked at that and I thought, this seems like a contrast, or this seems like the National Constitution Center trying to bring in Tom Paine, trying to bring in the Pennsylvania Constitution in a way that would maybe make folks feel a little uncomfortable. So anyways, was just curious.
Okay, no, this is really it is important. Well, let me first tell you that the National Constitution Center is not a public entity. It's a private entity I believe on federal land. Okay, that's first. Second of all, twice I received, let's put it this way, twice what seemed to be an invitation for me to speak there was withdrawn. On one time it had to do with Paine, and another time it had to do with FDR. Now, okay, and what happened probably is that somebody bothered to check out who's this guy, Harvey J. He's got a new book out. Wow, great idea. Let's bring him in. And then somebody else said, no. No, in fact, when I looked at myself, I thought, what the fuck is going on here? I think there were libertarians who were, and I kid you not, capital L libertarians who were running the place. Okay. Having said that, I don't remember. I did visit the place one time, and I can't remember. So when they tell the story of the Constitution, they don't mention Paine's common sense and his plan for a charter, do they? Do you know?
I don't think in the general story you can search Tom Paine and find just a page on him, and I think one on common sense that just would give you.
Well, I mean, right? Okay. Yeah. So here's the thing. Oh, and it may well be, and by the way, it'd be interesting to know if what they've got from common sense. There's those there early on when I said that Paine talks about the making of a democratic polity on the small scale. He doesn't use the word democracy, but if one reads it, it's clear he's talking about that people have almost an innate democratic spirit about them. There are two political groupings that have always worshipped that section because there's a line in it that says, governments are a necessary evil. Okay. Basically, it appears as if he's lambasting government. But no, he's going to go on and lambaste the governments that existed. He offers actually a democratic argument, the possibility of creating a democratic republic in miniature, what he's done there. I mean, I could go, I'd take too long to tell the whole story, but it's libertarians and anarchists who grab hold of that paragraph. Keep that in mind. And it's as if the libertarians never went on to read the rest of the pamphlet. Okay. So it's possible that they're grabbing hold of that, government is a necessary evil kind of language. I don't know. But I'm going to tell you something else, which is kind of funny. There's the Constitution Center on this stuff. It ought to be they figured, okay, you've got Independence Hall. They'll talk about the Declaration there. But it's not, keep in mind, it's not a public agency, a public initiative. It was a private initiative that did that. So I went to any number of times in my life. I've gone to Independence Hall and I've heard the Rangers, whatever their title is, give the speech on the making of the Declaration of Independence there in Independence Hall. And they do a decent job. I don't have any trouble. But I thought to myself, this would be a far more interesting story if they've noted the fact that there in Philadelphia, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, and that those folks in the room didn't have the courage to call for independence, would never have called for independence had Paine not written Common Sense. Because Paine, Common Sense became, as you've noted, a massive bestseller throughout the colonies. I mean, huge numbers were sold. And in fact, when people read that, they would meet in town halls and in other kinds of committees, and they started writing letters to Congress saying, independence, we want independence, we're prepared for action. They didn't move Congress on that until they started getting all these letters, and they imagined themselves losing control of the situation. And that's when Congress acts. And in fact, they knew damn well by that time that Paine had been the author, and that may have scared them as well, that this working man had written this pamphlet and not one of themselves. So, so when we got out of the talk by the ranger, as you come out of Independence Hall, he's there to accept he doesn't take tips, but to accept, compliments. And I said to him, actually, I have to tell you something. Have you ever thought about amending your talk and talking about Thomas Paine and Common Sense? And he said, I wouldn't do that. And I don't know if it's because the script is written for him or because, he just wasn't going to include the radical voice of Thomas Paine in his talk. But everyone should still visit Philadelphia.
For sure. Well, I just want to thank you, Harvey, for this really amazing conversation, the story time. I really appreciated it. I know Luke appreciated it. And maybe we can have you on another time at some point to discuss.
That would be fun. It was a pleasure. For the last few years, I've been doing 90% of my talks and conversations around Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and the labor movement. And your invitation, I thought, wow, that'd be great. I love, he's my hero, Thomas Paine. I mean, I recently brought out a comic strip with the cartoon creator or comic creator, Matt Strackbine, the letter hack. And if anyone goes on to Twitter, just look for Harvey J. Kaye. You can get a link there to that comic, which came out in Common Dreams. Now, that's on the Economic Bill of Rights that FDR first called for and has been a current in American history right to the present. But Matt and I are talking about possibly turning my book, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, into a graphic novel. So it's a good time for me to be talking aloud about Paine again. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Luke, go ahead. Luke.
I was just going to say, I hate to ask you one more question, but I figure while we have you here, unless you have to go. Or
No, I'm okay.
Okay.
We've only been doing this for what? An hour and 40 minutes? Go right ahead.
There was a book, and it's killing me now that I erased it from my notes. There was a book that came out in 2010, 2011 by a professor, I want to say at, not at Oregon State, but somewhere in Oregon. It's killing me that I forgot the name. It's a very interesting book. It's about Paine. The cover actually has, it's a slander. It's supposed to be a slanderous picture. I'm sure you know who drew it, but of Paine carrying kind of a satchel of daggers or something, and around him are all the various.
I have an idea, but it's not in my head. What you don't remember the book, do you?
Well,
let me ask you this: Is the author actually at Willamette?
I think they are at Willamette.
Oh, so that's I know because I ran across an article of his, which was all about how rights of man. What? Go ahead, tell me.
Oh, I found it. So let's see. Tom Paine's America: The Rise and Fall of Transatlantic Radicalism in the Early Republic by Seth Kotler.
I know Seth. Okay. We haven't been in touch for quite a long time, but when he was a brand new assistant professor, and I ran a speaker series here at the university for years, I thought I said, hey, Seth, it'd be fun if we could get together. How about if you come out and talk here at UW Green Bay? So yes, that is a good book. That's a very good book.
Yeah. Well, Seth, if you're listening, here's your plug to come on the show. But, okay, this book came out 10, 12, 14 or so years ago. Where does interest in Tom Paine sit these days in general? I suppose
Well,
both within the academy, but just sort of in general. Do you have people reaching out to talk about him?
yes, yeah, no, there is a lot of interest in Thomas Paine. Okay, but there was always, as I said, a lot of interest in Thomas Paine. An example of the interest would be, and I'm not trying to get people to buy anything at Amazon, but but Amazon's database is probably the best database to use for any book question. If you just plug in Thomas Paine's name, you find out how many editions of Common Sense and Rights of Man and his other writings are available. You can see they're not going to publish all these things and make them available. Look, they don't need to publish the books because it's available online, Common Sense. But publishers still do that. Why? Because there's a lot of interest in Thomas Paine. That is the case. Yes.
Why?
Why? Because
why hasn't interest faded?
Well, look. In part because ever since Ronald Reagan quoted Paine, you could now talk about Paine in public. And the new right hijacked him. The conservatives hijacked Thomas Paine. Look, when all of a sudden evangelicals are referring to Thomas Paine, when all of a sudden conservatives and neoconservatives, when they're doing that, they're hijacking Thomas Paine. And as a consequence, it means even conservatives now are interested in Thomas Paine. Now, do they understand who Thomas Paine really is and what his arguments were? No, but every American carries around with them the spirit of Paine. I used to tell my students this. When I turned 50 and I was teaching this big class, I walked in that morning. I had to get it off my chest. I said, I turned 50 today. And I said, that may sound old to you guys, but I gotta tell you something. If you took 5 of me and laid me out head to toe chronologically, if you could, and go back, in other words, say, even just 200 years, 250 years, you'd be where? You'd be back in the 18th century. You'd be back in the Revolution period. In fact, don't forget, the 250th anniversary is coming up So that may also be another reason there's some renewed interest. But so I said to students this, then I said to them, look, you're 18, you're 20 years old. Have you ever heard your mother or father speaking through you so that you can actually hear echoes of your parents and you swore you'd never be like your parents? So think about it this way. Think about generations. Why do we assume if a generation passes that their legacy is not, that we're not carrying in our own fashion, their sensibilities, their legacies? Of course, it's our lives. Of course, we may not even know the details of their lives. But if you can hear your parents in your head when you don't want to, why do you assume you're not hearing grandparents or great-grandparents? And I think, keep in mind, if in every generation, these movements were grabbing hold of Paine and talking about Paine, and there were a lot of presidents of the United States used Paine's words and never referred to. Barack Obama, at his inaugural address in Washington in 2010, quotes Thomas Paine in his speech, but doesn't cite Thomas Paine. And I remember I was in D.C., that I wasn't on the Mole that day, and I was watching the speech, and I said, what? I thought, those are Thomas Paine's words. And then my friend Bill Moyers sent me an email and said, Harvey, were those Paine's words we just heard? And I quickly did a search on Google, and I said, of course it is. It's these words from Common Sense. And I thought, why didn't Obama quote Thomas Paine? Why didn't he cite Thomas Paine's name? Right? And then I realized, well, look, Obama had an evangelical do the invocation at the inaugural. And maybe he was afraid that if he quoted Thomas Paine, he'd be pissing off certain kinds of folks. Okay. But it doesn't mean that it's not there. So we carry look, everybody should grab a copy of Common Sense. Just buy a copy. You can get it easy enough. Put it next to your bed. Let's say you wake up at night, you don't know how to get back to sleep. You're not going to pick up Common Sense to help you fall asleep. You're going to pick up Common Sense because it's going to sound like a letter from an old friend.
Well, I think on that very nice note, I think we should conclude this episode. But
I want to thank you. This was fun.
Yeah,
thank
it was a lot of fun.
To go back to Paine is always a pleasure.
Oh yeah, thank you, Harvey. Thanks so much for talking and sharing what you know and your life, and it's wonderful. And yes, I hear my mother and my father speaking speaking through me. So yeah.
That's
Okay,
beautiful.
well, be well.
Thank you. You too.